questions. Who wants to get started? Okay, over to you. Just hand that around to whoever wants to ask a question. Just speaking. It is a mic, I guarantee you.
Okay.
We're not winding you up.
Yeah. So you obviously develop around the country. Do you find much difference in the build cost between Gloucester and obviously London?
Yeah, so build costs in London, in Gloucestershire or in Gloucester itself, are about 120 to 140 pounds a square foot. So on our Lime Grove development, we're probably at the top end of that range because we're doing quite a high spec on those
140.
houses. More like 140, but we could build for 120.
When you say build costs, is that literally everything included, professional fees, finance costs, total development cost, or is that purely construction, superstructure, internal fit-outs, foundations?
Okay, so that's pure construction cost of the structures.
Okay.
So it doesn't include, for example, the road or any one-off items that are, that have a specific cost associated with them. I'm just trying to think on that Gloucester site. So the additional costs on that site will be things like construction of the road. The road's about 200 grand.
Sorry?
The road is about 200 grand. There's the sewerage under the road. We've also got Section 106 contributions. So including the contribution for the removal of the tree, that's about £90,000. On top of the build cost, we would normally add 5% contingency.
5%,
And we would normally add at least 5% for professional fees. So on that project, it's actually more like 8%.
Okay. Do you generally find that 5% professional fees is enough?
It depends. It depends. So it depends how much you think you're gonna need in terms of professional fees. To take an example, on that Clapham Road project, it's surrounded by other buildings. So you're going to have to put party wall agreements into place with all the neighbours. The cost of those party wall agreements or cost of professional fees on those party wall agreements is probably going to be £100,000. So that's a one-off cost. So that you would only incur on that project that you wouldn't incur on another.
Yeah.
So I think the answer is how much professional work is likely to be required. Is there some complicated engineering design that you might need to have done? The architect's fees, is the architectural design particularly difficult for some reason? Are you going to have party wall issues? Are you going to need lots of surveys, things like archaeological surveys or environmental surveys or reports on particular things like right to light, for example? I think what we tend to do with professional fees is we take the same approach as we do with construction costs. So we kind of break it down to what are the reports and surveys we're going to need, and then how much are those going to cost. If you've already got a detailed planning consent with all of the conditions satisfied, then probably the professional fees are going to be limited. If you're buying a site and you're putting a planning application in from scratch, the costs of that are going to be a lot, and you're going to need a lot of reports and surveys to go with it. So I think it depends on what your starting point is and what the issues are with the site. But I think the answer is, with many things in development, is break it down into its individual components, and then once you've got the individual components, build it back up again.
Okay.
In terms of understanding costs, that it's very simple, but that's the right approach. You just break it down into its component parts, and then cost all of those component parts individually, and then build it back up again.
Yeah.
At the end, you were talking to the gentleman about the different contracts. And the design and build.
Yeah.
Could you just give me a rough sort of outline as to the three types that you were talking about?
Sure. So I didn't want to go through it when I was standing up here because it's quite a complicated subject. But essentially in construction there are three main forms of contract and these are usually JCT forms of contract because that's the standard form of contract in the construction industry. And so the first one is what you'd call a JCT traditional contract. So with a traditional JCT contract, what you get is a situation where you are expected, you as the developer or if you're building for yourself, the builder, well, not the builder, but whoever's commissioning the work is expected to pay for the detailed design. So what the detailed design means is, as opposed to the planning drawings, the detailed drawings that the architect puts together, which show the builder exactly how to build the thing.
Yeah, I understand.
Detailed structural plans, anything else that's needed to be designed in order for the thing to be built is the responsibility of the developer. Yeah? And so what tends to happen in that situation is that the architect will draw the plans up, and then you'll give them to the builder, and the builder will then usually price them up. But when it actually comes to constructing it, the builder will say, well, actually, how the fuck do I build that? Because the problem is that architects don't understand, a lot of the time, they're designers, and so they don't understand the practicalities of actually building stuff. So when it comes to actually building the things that's shown on the plans, which the builder might have priced up, it isn't actually possible to build it that way.
It looks nice on 2D, it's different when you're actually on site in 3D.
Exactly. Now, some architects who have a lot of experience in building things are less likely to fall into that trap. But you will always get situations where there's this discrepancy between what's on the plans and what can actually be done. And so what happens in that situation is you end up with a variation. And the person that pays for the variation is not the builder, it's you. So the builder will say, actually, this is what you told me to build, I can't build it, it's going to have to be changed, and you're going to have to pay for that. And then you're in a situation where you're halfway through the project, you've already appointed him, so you can't go off and get someone else to do that thing. So you're not in a very strong position in terms of price negotiation. And so what happens on contracts like that is that the builder makes their money out of variations. And the same goes for the structural design. And obviously the structural design's got to work with the architectural design, and you have other design elements, mechanical and engineering, in other words, plumbing and electrical as well. So that's the first form of contract. Design and build contract is the theory of it is designed really to get around that issue, that kind of gap between the detailed design and the construction piece of it. And so with a design build contract, what you do is you make the detailed design the responsibility of the building contractor. So you can take a set of planning drawings, which don't have any detailing about how the thing is going to be built on it, just give them to the builder and say, build that. And then the builder gets to decide. You can be as specific or as vague as you want, but in its vaguest form, design and build is, I just want that house, it needs to look like that. You decide how you're going to build it, whether it's going to be timber frame or masonry, how the foundation is going to be designed. All of those issues are yours. In reality, in design and build, you want something that's going to be delivered to a certain specification, so you will specify certain things. So when we do design and build, we'll specify the kitchens and the bathrooms and the internal finishes. We'll often specify the windows. So we'll do quite a high level of detail in terms of specification. But the builder is left to determine the specific construction technique themselves. And what that means is, in theory, and sometimes it does work this way in reality as well, is that if a builder can build more cost effectively using a particular method, then they can be more competitive than other contractors. So some builders can build more cost effectively using timber frames, some can build more cost effectively using masonry, maybe because they've got a team of bricklayers in-house that have worked for them for years. It's quite strange. I mean, the two contractors taking the same construction approach to the same project can come out with quite different prices. So in that situation, then the builder employs the architect and the structural engineer and all the other professionals, and so that detailed design responsibility and the interface between them and the design professionals is up to them. So when I said that it's important to employ a contractor with which is reasonably financially stable under design and build, it's because in that situation, if they cock something up and it costs them money, you need to be able to push that problem back to them, because essentially you're relying on them to deliver you a fixed price. And what often does happen though with design and build contracts is if a contractor's in a situation where they know they're going to end up losing money, they'll just make the whole process very difficult. And I think that's actually the problem that we had on the Hyde site. The contractor had quoted very competitively for the business, and we were in a situation where we had development finance that only covered a certain amount, so we couldn't stretch the budget. So we just ended up with a lot of difficult conversations. We got there in the end, but it was very painful.
Is it more hands-off? Is that the idea?
It is more hands-off. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so with design and build, the theory is, and the practice is to a large extent, you don't have to worry about those detailed design issues that come up. So with traditional build, you're always answering questions with the builder, and with design and build, to a much lesser extent.
So you give them the initial design, and then from then on they work through the construction?
You just give them the layout, and you give them as much detail as you want to, and usually that's done in the form of a tender pack.
Yep.
So normally when I've done design and build, we've put it out to tender to maybe 5 or 6 contractors, generally through a quantity surveyor, and then that tender pack tells them exactly what it is that you want in terms of detail, and if the contract's awarded to them, that's what they've got to build. And it's up to them, unless you specify it otherwise, it's up to them how they build it.
So the tender pack went through a quantity surveyor, you're saying?
So we would generally engage a quantity surveyor to put our tenders out.
That works for you, that you're employing.
Yeah, they'll put the tender pack together, which is a specification of work, so it'll include the type of contract, any modifications to the standard JCT contract that we want, all the detailed specifications that we want. That goes out to the contractor and they bid based on that.
That sounds like what Richards would be quite good for doing this.
Yeah. So that's two of them. The final one. So you also asked about construction management. Yeah. So construction management is neither one nor the other. It's essentially a situation where you employ the contractor to manage the construction process on your behalf.
Yeah.
So they still do the same job, but essentially they either put a very small margin on it, or you pay them a management fee, and they just pass the stuff through to you at cost. So that situation is one that contractors often like because they don't take any risk. You know, so there's no kind of there's no issue of, you know, whether or not they have to cover the cost. You cover all of the cost.
Yeah.
But usually in those construction management arrangements, you want to build in some sort of incentive for them to actually.
I was going to say, what's to stop them spinning it out?
Well, nothing. But so you have to build that into the arrangement.
Yeah.
So with the construction management project or arrangement that we have on Gloucester, we have a fixed fee over the life of the project. So if they don't deliver it quick enough, then the amount of fee that they end up with reduces. Does that make sense? So in essence, the fee is split month by month over the project. But if they're going slowly, then the amount of the remaining fee is split over the rest of the project. We've also got an incentive for them to minimise costs in there, so they get a percentage of the cost savings. I think with that arrangement, you have to have a high level of trust with the contractor. You have to make sure that the individuals that you're working with are aligned with what it is that you want to do.
Okay. We're talking to one contract at the moment.
Got that. Yeah. So just so we can get the sound.
We're talking to a contract at the moment about doing a kind of cost plus and then get an incentive at the back end as well. So they're looking at, obviously it's open book, so they would be transparent with their costs, for instance.
Yeah.
And then they're talking about a 10% on top of that, effectively.
So
I think that's reasonable.
It depends what it is. How big's the project?
Well, we're still deciding. We haven't got a project in mind. It's just, I suppose, trying to build up the relationship and get the framework of how that might work, basically.
Okay. I mean, what sort of size projects are you envisaging? Are you talking?
Well, 10 units up, basically.
Okay. And so, sorry, cost plus 10%?
Yeah, that's what he's put forward.
Okay, and no management fee?
No. And then obviously, like you said, a share of savings and a share of the profits at the back end.
That's probably not an unreasonable arrangement, but I think, I'll repeat what I said earlier, with those sorts of arrangements, it's very important that you feel that you can trust the other party. I think you end up with a lot of detail on construction projects. I mean, the number of invoices that you end up with on a project, a £2 million project even, is enormous.
Yeah.
So what you really need is some way of auditing that.
Yeah, well, it would all go into an accounting system.
So you don't really want an accountant for that. Okay, you do need to put it through an accounting system, but you really want a quantity surveyor to audit it.
Yeah.
So I would work the cost of a QS into
We've got
your
a
project.
QS who would work on the project. So.
Yeah. So, but I think you need to. I don't think you want to audit every invoice or check every, but you probably want to take samples of things just to make sure that you're not paying for things that are going somewhere else, because that's the risk.
Different sites.
Yeah. I mean, if a contractor's working over multiple sites, how do they even know which invoice is relevant to you and which is relevant to them, and what's to stop them, charging invoices to you that are being used for stuff that's being used on another site? I think the way that we've done it with our project is we've divided the project into packages, and so we've got transparency on each package, and if a package is coming in over budget, we can start digging into the costs on that package and trying to understand why. Some of the packages are very easy. So one of the packages is the timber frame, and so there aren't, there's probably only, I don't know, 3 or 4 invoices that will come from the timber frame supplier. There's a deposit, there's one that we pay at a certain stage, another one we pay at a later stage. And so it's quite clear what those costs are, and it's quite easy to audit them. But if you've got something like groundworks, where you've got, I don't know, the cost of machine hire, you've got gravel, you've got all sorts of things. You need a way of trying to keep a track on that, and really the only way to do it is to set a budget for it and then measure it against that budget, because you need to know if partway through the project the thing isn't going to plan in terms of cost in a particular area. So I think it requires more detailed hands-on management, and I think, we always work quite closely with the QS on our projects, but I think with that arrangement you need to make sure that you've got a way of making sure that you can get your head around those costs, because they can get out of control very easily, particularly if there's only one of you and you've got a builder sitting there just spewing out bills and saying, well, that's your problem.
I think the plan was that we create a tender pack, put it through to quote against. That becomes almost like the baseline, and then you kind of track it against that effectively.
That can work, as long as you just make sure that you've got a very good mechanism for cost tracking, which a QS can help you put together.
Okay. Anyone else? I'll just
Anyone
ask a question.
Okay.
I'm interested in when you're talking about the planning side of it, and you're going through the 3 stages, as you're getting more and more detailed. How closely were you working with the council planners in that process, or were you just working out this is what we want to try and achieve, and then just not telling them, and then moving to the next level, and then telling them the next bit, and then moving to the next, or were you working quite closely with them to discuss it, to say, well, this is what we want to try and end up at the end, and can you help us work through the processes to get the best benefit?
Yeah, so I don't think you ever want to show your hand completely with planners, because I think if you apply for one thing and they think you're then going to go back and apply for another thing, then they'll try and take that into account in whatever application it is that they're considering. And so I think for me the process is just, with the planners, just focus on the thing that's in hand and don't talk about whatever the rest is. And then once you've got that secured, then go in with the next thing. Sometimes they don't like that, but at the end of the day the process is so tortuous, you kind of have to take that approach. There isn't really another way through it.
We just done a very simple one, which is just an extension on the back of the terraced house. And again, we spoke with the planners, and he actually helped us get the 2 stages through and split the project that we were trying to put into 2.
Well, if
it was a small project and it was a simple process. I just think it was a bigger process.
So firstly, planners are often not that helpful as you describe. They tend to be more helpful towards householders than developers. So if they think you're a developer, all of a sudden the game changes. They I don't know why, but people who are just doing an extension to their house tend to get an easier ride, because I guess developers are just sort of seen as being bad.
He knew we were a developer, and it's for he knew what the end result was.
But was it?
We were being straight.
Was it for an extension for your own house? Or
No. It's for an HMO.
For an HMO. Okay. Yeah. Well, look, they can be helpful. Look, I'm not saying that planners are always unhelpful, but I think my experience is that the bigger the project, the more contentious it becomes.
That was what I was trying to identify how closely.
I couldn't even get a telephone one-to-one with a planner in the Torbay region last week.
Okay.
Please email us this, please put in your check and your pre-submit application, and then someone will be in contact with you. They wouldn't, I just wanted to introduce yourself, they wouldn't even take my call.
No, so some planning authorities will make you always pay for pre-apps. Some will do pre-apps for free. I know Forest Dean District Council still do free pre-apps.
Right.
But I think if you put in an application without having done a pre-app, they don't tend to like it. I think they prefer you to tune the application and get it sort of to their satisfaction before you submit it. So I think that pre-app process is a good way of getting the planners on board before you actually submit something. Yeah. Great. Anyone else? No? Yeah, sure. Sorry. Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So, with the colleague, we've just taken on a bank. The next bank. It needs completely ripping out all the way through to put open plan offices upstairs.
Okay.
And a big retail unit downstairs.
Okay.
Which of those three setups would you go with on that sort of scheme?
So sorry, what are the three setups?
So
The contracts that you spoke about earlier. Which one would you go with?
Oh, I see. Which form of contracting?
In the past, they've used subbies, and it's kind of run away. It's just kept going.
Yeah.
It's very intensive.
Okay. So this is an existing building.
Yeah.
Is it listed?
It is.
Okay. How many square feet?
It's 1,800 per floor, so 5,500.
Okay. And are you doing a complete gut? And
Yeah. So the
or
idea
are
is
you
on
using some of the existing structure?
No, well, the existing obviously roof and the outside of building.
Yeah.
But in terms of the all the offices in the ground floor,
Yeah.
that lot can get ripped out.
Okay.
To make one big.
So you're going to rip
retail.
everything out internally,
Yes.
and you'll be putting new walls and partitions in.
Exactly. It depends what the tenant wants to do on the ground floor.
Oh, okay, you've got a pre-let on the ground
Yes.
floor. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So then the first and second floors, it's all a lot of that is structurals, but it still needs to be open plan for the market that it is now.
Right. So I think if you can get a contractor to do it on a design and build basis, that would probably be the best way to do it.
Right.
But one of the problems with design and build can be that contractors, if it's in a tight market, contractors often won't bid for stuff on a design and build basis because they don't have to.
Right. Okay.
Because they don't like it because it throws the risk over to them. So it
Exactly.
depends. So if the market's tight,
Yeah.
you're probably better with a contract management arrangement
Yeah.
or a traditional form of contract. If you think that you're going to have quite a lot of builders who are going to be up for this particular piece of work, I'll put it out there as a design and build and just see what you get.
Okay.
Get the QS involved first to get like a tender pack together, you think? Or,
Yes, that's what I would do. Get a good QS, an experienced QS who's done it before.
Yeah.
And good QSs often have a good set of contractor contacts as well,
Yeah,
so they
that's
may be
what-
able to bring in some of their own contractors. Work with them very closely to put the tender pack together. I mean, what they should do is put the structure together for you, but you should really go through that in detail and just make sure it's exactly what you want. So, when I talked about 90% of the work being done before you even start work on site, 90% of the spec is in that tender pack. Anything that you are not in a position to sort of spec it at the outset or want to sort of keep the design for yourself on, you can put in as a provisional sum. So what we do is we put provisional sums in for bathrooms and kitchens. So rather than having to decide the precise kitchen spec and layout that we want before we go to tender, because it's a bit early, we don't even have detailed drawings at that stage. What we do is we put in a provisional sum of, so for example on the Lime Grove project, I think there's 90 grand in there for kitchens. And then once we've got the detailed drawings, as part of the tender process, we say to the contractor they need to give us 1 to 50 scale drawings for the kitchens and the bathrooms. So we then give those to our kitchen and bathroom suppliers, and we work through the detail of the layout and specification of those particular areas. So the cost on those is up to us.
Yeah.
What should we be paying the QS?
Sorry?
What should we be paying and how much?
What do you think the total works value is? Did you say about 5,500 square feet?
It is, yeah.
So if it's listed, I would have thought it's going to be 120 pounds a square foot.
It's got to be, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I'd say your works value is 600 grand probably. Yeah.
Could be, yeah.
What you will end up paying a QS will depend largely on the size of firm it is. So a larger firm like Ward Williams, who are very good by the way, will be a lot more expensive than a sort of a smaller one-man band QS. I would go out to three of them and ask them for a quote.
Right. Okay.
And then what should you end up paying? I don't know. Maybe 20 grand on a project like that. Depends on the services you want from them. How much detail you want, how often you want them to come to site. Do you actually want them to manage the project on the way through? I mean, just to put a tender out and then analyse the tender responses, you could probably get that done for less than 10 grand.
Okay.
For a good QS. I mean, some will do it more cheaply, but I think what you really want is somebody who's worked on similar stuff to what you've worked on before.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
It's helpful, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
You mentioned something.
Sorry, let me just say, a good QS will save you money, by the way, especially in a design and build situation, because what you end up with, and even in a traditional build situation, we were talking about variations earlier on, and that being how builders make their money. What a QS can do is, if a builder gives you a price for a variation, a QS can break that down into its individual components. So, if let's say, for example, I don't know, the shape of the building changes, and so you've got a bit more floor space. So a QS can work out how much additional concrete is involved, how much additional brickwork, how much additional steel work, put rates and quantities to it, and then say to the contractor, actually, that's how much that should cost. I can't do that because I'm not sufficiently skilled, but a QS can. And so having a QS on your side when you're having those conversations with a builder about what things should cost is invaluable.
I've just recently worked on a £55 million project with 2 QSs battling it out, and it's, when it comes down to money, exactly what was said. I've had moments, what would you get this for, what would you get that for? I need to cost that against what different contractors do, saying, hey, I'm considered they try to almost £2 a week's higher. So I went back to QS and said, well, I can get 500 quid a week's higher. And they're very much on the way to go.
So QS needs to work and society as well.
Well, it's more, QS should be able to work the stuff out off the designs, off the plans, really.
Benefit of QS.
Because if you've got a change, you can see what the architectural change is. So you can look at one drawing and another drawing, and it's just a question of working out, what additional work is involved in that wasn't involved in this. Often what happens is the building contractors will try and charge you for the adds, but forget about the submits. So some stuff will be coming out and they haven't taken that into account. They'll just charge you for the additional stuff. Again, a QS will work through that and say, well, actually, you aren't just adding stuff, you're taking this away as well. And you net it out, and you might find actually that a change could actually save you money, rather than cost you money.
The contracts wouldn't work with the subbies, though, would it? You need to have a main contractor so overseeing the subbies.
Yeah, if you're doing it as design build, you have one main contractor and they're responsible for all the subcontractors.
So we design and build on the existing building. Unforeseen circumstances.
So
it's not like a new build.
No.
Is it?
So if there are significant risks on an existing building, then usually a design and build contractor won't give you a price, or they'll exclude certain items because they know that there's risk contained in those items.
Okay.
So the way to deal with that is to make sure that you have those risks contained up front. So for example, when we did the tender on the lock warehouse, we did a timber survey because there could have been some rot in the timber. We did a damp proofing survey. We did a bunch of surveys, and then we issued those with the tender so that we basically identified all the potential areas of risk, and we were assisted in that by our QS who helped us work through that. And then we put that out with the tender so that the contractors who were tendering knew exactly what it was that they were pricing up. Yeah, but you will find if there are things like that the contractor will come back with an exclusion.
Okay.
Yeah, and then that means they're not taking the risk on it, you are. And you might accept that, you might be happy with that. Or you might want them to take the risk on it. Sorry.
So you mentioned just about apart hotel schemes. What does that mean?
Okay, so so the apart hotel market it's a very interesting market in the UK. It's much better developed in other parts of the world than it is in the UK, but it's essentially grown out of this sort of serviced accommodation model that's been, proliferated by Airbnb and HomeAway. So it's grown out of temporary accommodation. So in the UK, the holiday or short stay market has traditionally been dominated by hotel chains.
Yeah.
The difference between an apart hotel and a hotel is that an apart hotel has usually a kitchenette of some sort and some living space. And so people tend to stay in apart hotels for more like 4 or 5 nights. So I think the average stay is maybe 3.5 nights or something like that. Whereas in hotels it tends to be 1 or 2 nights.
Yeah.
What's happened in the last, 5 or 6 years is that a number of apart hotel groups have grown out of companies that were formerly doing serviced accommodation. And so the biggest one of those is a company called Stay City. They started doing serviced accommodation in Dublin, individual units, and they were doing, and then they started doing maybe 10 buildings of 10 or 20. And what they now do is they do buildings with between 80 and 200 units. They've got something like 2,500 units operational now across Europe. And they've got something like 7,000 in the pipeline for the next 3 years. So they're growing the business very aggressively. And so because they've built quite a significant and profitable trading business, what they can offer for a developer is a relatively strong covenant, a covenant that's fundable by investors. So that enables them to compete with operators like Travelodge or Premier Inn. So essentially what it means is that if you sign a lease with them, you can get an investor to take that lease, a pension fund or somebody like that, to take that lease as an investment when the project's completed, or you can forward fund the project. So essentially you will sell the site to the investor and you develop it out for them. Yeah.
So
but the thing that's interesting about the apart hotel market as opposed to the hotel market is that the hotel market is relatively saturated. Some, Travelodge and Premier Inn do put up, and other operators do put up new hotels, but the apart hotel market is relatively new, and there are a number of operators there that are growing very quickly and very acquisition oriented. They're looking for new sites. So the reason why it's interesting from a development point of view is because these operators are out there very proactively looking to develop their presence in a number of UK cities.
What sort of number of units do they look for in the average size town, would you say? Or
Generally, depends on the operator, but generally between 80 and 200 is the sweet spot in terms of operating efficiencies. It depends on what you are and where you are, but that's the normal.
So I just need to talk to you later.
Okay.
And they were called, sorry, what,
Sorry? Stay City. Yeah. Is the biggest one. But there's a bunch of them. And they're all a little bit different in the approach that they take. Yeah. Good.
Very good. Yeah, very helpful.
Sure, pleasure. Great.
I'm very costs focused
Yeah.
in some sense.
Sorry?
I'm very costs focused.
Okay, good. You need to be.
When you talk about roads and things, what do you cost per square metre or per linear metre or however you cost? Or do you just leave that to your QS and he tells you whatever figure it is?
I can't remember actually the last time I costed a road. I did look at it when we costed the road for the Gloucester site.
Yeah.
But I can't remember what it was per square metre off the top of my head, sorry.
That's right. Because on my appraisal, if it's a private road, I'm putting £100 a square metre basically. If it's an adopted road, it's £200 a square metre.
It's probably about right. But I'm a little rusty on that. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's been a little while since I looked at a road cost.
Sure.
Have you got any questions? You've been quiet.
Yeah, I have. That's on purpose. All these other people are so advanced.
Well, that's fine.
I did find it quite interesting when you said about that you went from just a standard like refurb up to 10 units.
Yep.
So you experienced quite a lot of difficulties, didn't you, in the 10 units you said, because I can't remember the reasons, but you went from the straightforward refurb and then you scaled up quite quickly.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of there or thereabouts, and you haven't done this like your whole life, have you? Because you were in telecom before, weren't you?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
So
but look, I've been doing it now for 17 years, so
okay.
I have a pretty good idea of what I'm doing.
Yeah, of course.
But then, I've only been doing it for maybe 2 years, so no, I didn't know a lot about it at all.
I'm at that point now, so I've been doing it for 2 years, and I've been doing refurbs and renovations and flips and HMOs and buy-to-lets, etc. But I'm trying to get onto that next part of the market where I want to get into new builds or commercial conversion, but in all honesty, I don't even know where to start.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, like, the kind of challenges that you faced and the most difficult thing that you found from scaling up. Because you said you probably did it a little bit too big.
I did. I mean,
I know you said find someone more experienced.
I think that is the key to it. I didn't actually talk about all the problems that we had on that site, because I would have been here all night if I had.
Yeah,
I could do a whole presentation on that single site. But I think probably the biggest thing that, looking back, I wish I'd done differently is not started work on site immediately. And the reason for that is that site actually, looking back now, I realise had a lot of potential for enhancement, for planning enhancement.
You said that, didn't you?
That we've realised on the Gloucester site, but we didn't take advantage of on that site. So actually we did end up building 11 houses. So originally had consent for 10. And we had a large detached house at the end. We realised halfway through the build, actually we could get 2 semi-detached houses on there, and that would be a lot more valuable. It actually did add quite a bit of value to the site, but what became clear as a result of that process is that actually we could have done that all the way through the site and made the whole thing a lot more valuable. And that was one thing. I think another thing was that the builder that I was working with, he was good on projects that were, maybe 4 or 5 houses, but building 11 houses is different to building, 1 or 2 houses or 3 or 4 houses.
Yeah.
it requires you get to a point where you require a level of project management skills that he just didn't have, and so the whole thing became a bit messy. And so we were effectively in a joint venture arrangement where we were sharing costs, and it became clear to me that A, his costs were out of control, and B, he didn't know what his costs were. So I had to get very deeply involved in the management of the thing to try and get the thing under control, and it was a very painful process.
Did you do any builds before that? Was that your first one?
New builds?
Yes.
No.
That was your first one?
Yes, although, I mean, I've done some pretty deep refurbishments, but yeah.
This is where I'm stuck, because I've done deep refurbishments and I've done all these other bits, but it's going from nothing to like that larger site. Where'd you start? Like even with the packaging and breaking it down, like what you said earlier about taking different bits.
Okay, so in retrospect, it probably would have been better for me to do a 2 or 3 unit site than jump straight into doing an 11 unit site, because I would have learned a lot of the stuff that I needed to know for the 11 unit site, and I would have gone into that less green.
It's just a completely different field, isn't it, from having an existing building already there, from all the other costs and surveys and reports and everything that you need to think about, and it just becomes an absolute minefield.
Well, I mean, one of the big things actually on that project was road adoption. So if you build more than 5 units that are served by a single road, you have to get the road adopted. I didn't actually know that when I started doing that.
I wouldn't have known that.
Well, you wouldn't. Well, I did, but it would have been better if I hadn't done so. What I'm saying is, if I had known about the road adoption process, we would have got that project done a lot quicker and with a lot less problems. I didn't, and so it kind of hit me halfway through the project, and I had to work out how to deal with it, and that was pretty stressful. Yeah.
Have you had any sites with public rights of way, like a public footpath? So we're looking in the south at the moment. The public footpath goes straight to the middle of it, and you've got houses on the other side. So we need to get that redirected. I was just wondering if you've done that.
No, not a public right of way. I've had sites with private rights of way.
Okay.
But no, not a public right of way. Never done that. That's one of the few things I haven't done. I've done a lot of things, but not that. I'm going to start looking at that now.
Giving them something to think
the thing
about.
is, so you don't. I guess you probably know this. You do know this, but you don't tend to actually look into the detail of how to deal with a particular issue until you actually come across it. And so I think I learn something new on every development that I do. You know, because each development site is different. There's always something that you come across that that you haven't come across on a previous one. But I guess the less things you come across, then if everything that you come across is new, you've got a huge learning curve. If you're only coming across 1 or 2 new things, then you can afford to take the time to focus on those things and really understand them properly.
The larger the projects get, do you find it harder to analyse the deal and substitute all the costs? Because do you work from the backwards? Do you work from the GDV backwards, or do you start from the offset and then work forwards?
There's 2 things. I mean, the GDV and the costs are 2 separate things. I mean, they're driven by what it is you're going to build, both of those things. But they're just inputs to the appraisal.
I think when you
and whatever the numbers are, they just, what the thing's worth drops out the bottom. They're almost separate in a way. You need to work on both. So if I'm looking at an appraisal, the 2 things that I'm looking at are what can be done with this thing and what can it be sold for. And that, if it's resi, then there's a lot of market research about comparables and demand and how quickly can this number of units be sold in that particular location. If it's costs, it's about understanding everything that needs to be done. Right.
This is the bit that I struggle with.
So actually, 80% of that stuff is, if there's a planning consent in place, 80% of that stuff is on the planning consent notice, because planning consent notices will contain conditions. So one of the first things that I do if I'm looking at a site is I go to the planning portal and I download all of the documents and then I read them. The first thing I'll normally read is the planning consent notice. The next thing I'll normally read is the planner's report to committee. But whatever happens, whether it goes to committee or whether the planner makes a decision under delegated powers, he will write a report. And that report will detail all the issues that he or she considered when he or she was looking at the granting consent, and it'll essentially reason through how they got to the conclusion that they did. And so that provides useful background to the planning consent notice. The planning conditions identify a significant proportion of the things that you will have to deal with in the course of the development, and the things that might not come up on a planning consent notice are things like, well, the thing that definitely won't is ground conditions. So if you want to establish whether or not the ground is suitable for building on, you need a geotechnical survey or a borehole. You need someone to come and actually test the ground conditions. The other one that you need to watch out for is environmental. So if it's a brownfield site that's been built on before, particularly if there's been industrial use, you could have contamination in the ground.
Certainly in Cornwall,
you might have petrol or
exactly. Radon.
Yeah, or what? So radon is different to contamination. Radon is kind of ground gas.
Yeah.
And it isn't. Radon is not horrendously expensive to deal with. You just need to put a radon barrier. So it's not, they're not cheap, but it's not of the kind of scale of issue that something like an archaeological, some ruins under your site could be.
So how would you, if there's a condition for archaeological survey, how do you budget what a survey is going to cost? And how much time that could take?
I will try to push things onto the vendor.
If
there's an archaeological condition, I would say to the vendor, do you have an archaeological survey? You've got to realise that anyone else looking at the site is going to be in the same position as you are, and most people don't like taking risks. So if you've got an archaeological condition, that means that there's some suspicion that there's some archaeology under there, and if there's an archaeological condition which requires you, for example, to do a survey before you commence development, it would be entirely reasonable to ask the vendor to do an archaeological survey.
So tell him to do it.
Yeah, well, because it's his site, right? And then and let you have that before you commit to the site. Now, some vendors don't like spending money, and so I guess a way to deal with it, the way that I would tend to deal with that sort of situation is, if I really like the site, or I think it's got potential, then this is what we did with the site we bought off the county council, is get agreement to do the archaeological survey before exchange, and then then at least you're not in a position where you've got to commit before you know what's in the ground. But I think something like that is not a risk that, unless you're fairly sure that the whatever's under there is going to be minimal, it's not a risk you can really take.
Complete, and then they find something, and then you're like, well, that's the end of that site.
Exactly, you may not be able to develop it at all. That one is a big one. It's a showstopper potentially. Cost of environmental cleanup can be very expensive.
I've seen a few of those, and I can see why it hasn't sold, because it's got this condition in there. Sure,
but the thing is about that, it will put other people off. And so if you can work out a way of containing the cost, or at least somehow, just containing it. If you think at the worst case it might be 200 grand, and you build that into your appraisal, and then it turns out to be 10, well, you're okay. But if it turns out to be 200, well, that's what you budgeted for anyway. So sometimes there are ways of containing these things, and or making sure that there's a point that they can't go beyond. I mean, every site is different, and I think a lot of the key to making sites work is to actually work through that detail and find a deal that works for you and the vendor, and but allows you to contain your risk.
Have you done much with retaining walls?
Quite a lot.
What system have you used? Have you found one that's cheap and cost effective but easier to do? And how big are your retaining walls?
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, a lot of questions.
You're going to ask me about all the retaining walls I built. I'll tell you, I'm going to answer one of those questions. So I did a retaining wall on a site in Gloucestershire, which would work in certain circumstances, and it did work really well in this particular circumstance, where you put a foundation in, and you get these big L-shaped reinforced concrete things. They have stone faced on one side, so the side that you see, and then the other side is just concrete. It's like a big concrete L.
Sure.
You bolt them to the foundation with a bolt that you glue on, and then you just backfill behind them. And so where you can actually excavate in front of where the retaining wall is going to go, and you can put these things in. I've forgotten what they're called. It's a very cost-effective way to do it. But I've also done these these retaining walls that you do in that interlocking wood, and then you let stuff grow on them. I've forgotten what they're called. I've done those.
Wood.
Yeah, it's like it's a wood structure, and then you grow. Gabion baskets are cool. I love those.
I like those.
But there's a limit to the height that you can do with them.
It's always at 6 degrees.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about gabion baskets is that and it might not sound like it's a good thing, but is that they move, and because if you build a concrete wall and there's movement in the structure behind it, it'll just crack. So with Gabion baskets, if there's a bit of movement, they'll allow for it without the thing, killing itself. And I like them; they look cool.
Yeah, I like them. I like the whole idea of this greenery growing on it effectively, and then becomes part of the wall.
So I like Gabion baskets because they're kind of a modern spin on something a bit traditional. But no, I do like them. I've actually never used them anywhere, but I really want to because I just love them. But I never have.
What is the interlocking wood thing?
I forgot what it's called, but I used it on the project in Colford actually. You basically you put the wood in to retain the wall, and then you grow plants on it, and the plants kind of pull the whole thing together.
Okay.
But I can't remember what it's called. If you Google interlocking wood with plants on it, retaining wall, you'll probably find it. It's got a name.
How go though? Because we're looking at a site which is on a bit of a slope, where the 3-story house, the 2 first stories are in the hillside.
I think it'll go that high because we did a pretty high one. But it's a question of the slope it'll contain or retain. It's quite attractive because you get vegetation on it.
Yeah, that's what I like that idea.
It's quite nice.
Because we want to build the house wall separate from the retaining wall.
Yeah.
And obviously if a Gabion basket, if it's 6 degrees, by the time you get to the 3rd story, you're going to have quite a gap between your house wall and the garden effectively. So you're going to have to build almost it could look quite cool, having a little walkway at the back there, but it just depends on how it looks really.
Yeah. Lots of options for retaining walls.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Thank you. I mean, whenever I see an appraisal or do an appraisal and there's costs I don't know, it's very much trying to Google costs, ask people.
Oh, good. So you're still the same even now.
I mean, look, there's a limit to how far you can go with that, and I think for me, I will get to the point where I'll just ask a QS to look at it. But I realise if you're looking at something speculatively, there's you can't be doing that all the time. The thing is, if you're working with a QS on a project, I tend to find that they're quite amenable to
looking at it.
Yeah, well, just you ring them up and say, look, I'm trying to build an X. What do you think? Or they often know what the best way or the most cost-effective way to build a particular thing is, or to deal with a particular problem. Okay, I'm being timed out.